Thank you. Just before we get started, my name's David Bolt, and I am the Director of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, and I just want to welcome you, officially as it were, but also I do want to thank everybody for coming. This is the first face-to-face event we've had in more than 2 years, for obvious reasons. I must say that, like many people here, there were times when it seemed like we wouldn't be able to do these things ever again. It seemed to go on, and of course, I'm not pretending that we're out of the woods, as they say, yet. But at least we can put this event on for the time being and see what happens next, as it were. A few people over the last couple of years have been asking me, you know, when are we going to do the next conference? What happened to the seminars we used to do every month and all of this, you know? Well, this is where we're at the moment, so I'm just glad that people have turned up to hear the various speakers and so on, and to celebrate and introduce different works, which is what the CCDS has done for nearly 13 years now. It's still something that, you know, when disability studies is still sort of attacked from many angles, you know, in various ways, everyone who's involved becomes effectively an activist. Just doing the work marks you out as some sort of activist. So, you know, that's why everyone is so enthusiastic about these events and so on, and all thanks to Owen, we will have this on YouTube in good time, which is something that's been keeping things going as well over the last couple of years. Along those lines, I mean, I will say that just before we went into the pandemic, not knowing what to expect, like nobody knew what to expect, I didn't really know even if I could carry on with the journal. It's hard to say that now, it sounds kind of pathetic, but all the materials are on my desk in my office. And I wasn't quite sure how I could work the journal from home, as it were, certainly with the equipment I had at that point. And I do remember sort of sneaking in at the very last moment with a memory stick and downloading various materials, setting me up in this wild imagination that, you know, just in case we were off for a full month or something like that. And of course it was months and months, and you all know this story perhaps better than I do. And obviously this has been a very tricky time for everyone. You know, let's be clear, probably everyone here has lost someone in these last couple of years. Many people here have been in particular quotes, vulnerable groups, you know. Time and time again we were told on the news that disabled people were at particular risk. I was working with lots of people on a book at that stage from around the world who were getting the same message, and it was somewhat confusing, if not disturbing. But, you know, here we are now, at least, as I say, sort of mocking this work that we do in and around the CCDS. One of the things that I've always tried to point out around the CCDS work is that this is meant to be community rather than competition. Too often in the modern day world, if you like, yes, I am sounding middle-aged, but I suppose I'm pushing that even out of the way rapidly. But, you know, too often it is really about, you know, just getting by and trying to succeed in one's own terms. This wouldn't work and could never work in relation to disability studies. It has to be community rather than competition, and that's something the CCDS has always tried to celebrate. Hence, we've got sort of overarching things like the journal. So JLCDS, I'm pleased to say I have not so long ago submitted the 50th issue of JLCDS, which is quite something. I mean, I was told originally that would never work as a journal, full stop. Well, 50 issues on, it is working, and it's working pretty well. And many of you have contributed to that journal in various ways, and I do appreciate that, whether you be someone who's written a comment, a book review, or whether you be book reviews editor, comments editor, special guest editors of issues. There's so much work has gone into JLCDS, and it's nice to be able to mark that with a 50th issue that actually brings together some of the most significant figures in cultural disability studies for sure. I won't name them here, but basically it brings together the work of various colleagues who put out a dozen books more than 2 decades ago that marked out the field in many ways of cultural disability studies. Another thing I'd perhaps like to mention is the literary disability studies series that we do here. This is, I do this in conjunction, or you know, my joint series editors are in New York, and that we've got a dozen books in that series now. So that's another one that seemed doubtful in many minds at one stage, and we've got, as I say, we've got 12 books there, one of which was written by Arianna, who's with us today. So and that's one of the most recent books in that series. Indeed, I know of 4 in that series that have been marked out in many ways here in this room. I won't go through them right now, but if you look at that series, you'll see that in literary disability studies, there's been quite a few sort of books introduced at conferences run by the CCDS. Another thing I'd like to mention, this will be my last one, and that's the Disability Studies MA, which has always been aligned with the CCDS. I'm pleased to say that we've got some of our Disability Studies MA students here with us today. Could you just give us a quick shout? Yes, thank you. And these, I've got to say, we've had such fantastic students over the last few years, and these have been an absolutely brilliant group, the first face-to-face group. But it's been a pure education for me every Monday and Wednesday, and I know colleagues who've taught on that course must have found the same experience. So thanks for your input, and also thanks for coming today. We've also got people here who are ready for the new year, which is nice as well, because obviously some students are part-time, so they'll be here in the new year. And I'd like to mention that for a particular reason. That's because next year will be the 10th year of the Disability Studies MA. So again, this is something colleagues will know was doubted that this could be viable. How could we have a Disability Studies MA? Well, we do have one, and it's nearly 10 years old, and we've got the best students, just the best students. I was stood here nearly 10 years ago, I suppose 9 years ago, introducing this idea that we were going to do a Disability Studies MA, and we had it all lined up thanks to colleagues. All we needed was a couple of students, and thankfully we did get literally 2 students for the first year. And one of them was Ella Houston, who's with us today as a colleague, which is another nice story, I think. You know, those are some of the things that the CCDS does. Today we're going to be introducing various new work. So we've got a panel, first of all, that's going to be chaired by Dr Owen Barden, who's an Associate Professor in Disability Studies here at the university. He also works on JLCDS as comments editor. So I'll let Owen talk about that panel. And then we're going to introduce the monographs and launch a couple of monographs as it turns out. It was going to be 3, but unfortunately Leah Birch can't be with us. She came down with COVID yesterday. So, you know, and again, this is someone who was on the Disability Studies MA, so I would have been really proud to see her launch her book at this event. But we will make space for that in a future event. But yeah, I've asked Dr Claire Penketh, who is Associate Professor of Disability Studies and Subject Lead, to chair that part of the day. And, you know, obviously it's always important to mark, I think, any books that people do, but especially monographs, you know, that sustained work that every monograph represents. So I look forward to hearing the speakers later on. So I'll leave that there. As I say, just welcome to all of you, and I hope you have a really good afternoon, and I know that you'll enjoy the work that our various colleagues will be sharing with us. So thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Isn't it good to be back in the room together? I even bought new shoes. You can't see them because I'm behind the lectern, but they're making me feel better. Anyway, so we have our first panel, lessons from the pandemic, and as David sort of alluded to there, the pandemic marked us all profoundly, didn't it? And disabled people in many ways more so than most. You know, the loss of services, social isolation, inequalities, do not resuscitate orders, mortality rates and all the rest of it. But alongside that, we also had the sense that it probably provided opportunities for the kind of resilience and creativity and interdependence and resourcefulness that Rosemary Garland-Thompson, for instance, talked about when she made her case for the conservation of disability. And so in the CCDS, we started 3 strands of work, really, to try and make sense of the pandemic. Beginning about this time last year with a couple of undergraduate scholarships where some of our second-year students did a literature review around the effects of the pandemic on disabled students in higher education, and it revealed that sort of mixed picture that I just sketched out there. And a second strand is ongoing, and that's a forthcoming special issue of the journal Social Inclusion with that same title, Lessons from the Pandemic. We've got a range of great international papers in with both empirical work and insiders' perspectives on disability, which Erin Pritchard, Anna Bay Pereira and Laura Waite, as well as myself, are all co-editing. Really looking forward to that. That should be coming out in round about November. So keep an eye out for that. And the third strand was meant to be a seminar series of the sort we've traditionally held, but things being as they have been, it's turned into this event here, which I'm sure is going to be absolutely splendid. So I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers without further ado. We have Saul Leslie, Nina Michelle Worthington and Arianna Introna. So I'll introduce them one by one. So first up is Saul Leslie. Saul studied literature and philosophy in Liverpool for his BA and then continued at University College London in an MA called Issues of Modern Culture. Before taking up PhD research on portrayals of disability and employment in post-1900 literature, he worked at various universities and higher education institutions in London as a disability supervisor and disability rights campaigner. Currently, he is accessibility officer for Address, a user-led disability organisation on Merseyside. He writes for Public Disability History and works as an amanuensis and editor with disabled writers for Penguin Random House. His own prize-winning fiction has been published by Liverpool University Press. Saul's paper is entitled Testimonials from the Frontline, demonstrating how lockdown challenged teaching and support methods for special educational needs and disability. So welcome, Saul.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here with you all and to kick off this event. So as Owen mentioned, my area of PhD research mainly revolves around portrayals of disability and employment in literature, and so what I'm going to present today might seem like a little bit of a departure from that, given that it's kind of testimonials and very qualitative. But it's, as far as I'm concerned, less of a departure than it is a return to the work I was doing before I began my PhD, which was, as Owen alluded to, in disability support at various educational institutions around London. And in tying the research I'm going to present to my own thesis, I hope to communicate today that the testimonials provided portray people working with disabilities under the intense pressures of employment uncertainty. And I think that their testimonials flag up questions about what it means to be employed, what the kinds of emotional demands are put on people to make those extra efforts in their jobs, and thus what kind of workforce we demand and require to work with people with SEND, that's special educational needs and disability. I should say there's a glossary, I've got a handout here for later if anybody wants some extra information about various terms which might be useful as I go through this presentation. And finally, what other question includes, what kinds of employment prospects are those students being prepared for? What kind of world of work can they expect to enter? And what are the views of those in frontline professions of disability educational support during the pandemic? Crucially also, I think it's essential that the views and experiences of those frontline workers do not become lost as more time elapses now that the lockdown has officially ended, or legally ended. And that's to say that while the lockdown is no longer being enforced, its legacy is still very present. It's been over 2 years since that first lockdown, and the participants who provided me with their testimonials have a slightly different view of what took place based on government decisions, or lack of decisions, on media reports of government management or mismanagement, and on the public's shifting attitudes towards COVID. And this came across in the interviews conducted where the chronology of events during the lockdown became blurred. So while I will attempt to capture a glimpse of a particular historical moment through the lens of disability and the viewpoints of educational professionals, it won't necessarily be chronological. I interviewed a number of people from the education sector, those delivering support to sixth form students with special educational needs. Some of these people worked in the classroom as student support, known as HLTAs, others in teaching and managerial roles in a SEN department, in charge of allocating resources for incoming SEN students entering sixth form, and I even interviewed someone who was the head of a sixth form specialising in SEN provision. The interviews took the form of a Q&A, the questions of which are on the handout I'll distribute afterwards if you'd like. And these questions were specially crafted to encourage participants to remember their first impressions of the pandemic and the new obstacles they faced and the opportunities which may have arisen during that lockdown. And I'm limited for time and aware that I stand between all of you and very esteemed speakers, so I will be brief just to say that the methodological framework that informed this research is kind of based on a piece of research that was conducted last year by colleagues at John Moores, Edge Hill and Liverpool University, entitled Ask, Listen, Act, which looked at the impact of COVID on the education, health and social care provision for children aged 5 to 15. My research, much more modest in its scale and ambition, follows on from this, looking at the experience of staff working with SEN sixth formers aged 16 to 19. That's the methodological influence. The other major influence on my research is the writing of Mark Fisher, and specifically his capitalist realism. It came out in 2009, and its focus on which kinds of disabilities or mental health conditions are considered legitimate or illegitimate reasons to be afforded entitlement to work or to not work. I found this book very instructive in formulating the questions I put to the interviewees, and this is the passage from Fisher that is going to be most useful. It's very long, but don't worry, I'll read it once and then isolate little parts of it as we proceed through the next part of the paper. So, teachers are caught between being facilitator entertainers and disciplinarian authoritarians. Teachers want to help students to pass exams. The role of the disciplinarian is demanded of educators more than ever at precisely the time when disciplinary structures are breaking down in institutions. With families buckling under the pressure of capitalism, which requires both parents to work, teachers are now increasingly required to act as surrogate parents, instilling the most basic behavioural protocols in students and providing pastoral and emotional support for teenagers who are in some cases only minimally socialised. So I'll now highlight 4 different excerpts from that passage and then show you testimonials which either challenge or affirm what Fisher is saying. So excerpt 1, or A. Teachers are caught between being facilitator entertainers and disciplinarian authoritarians. Teachers want to help students pass exams. The sixth form head, who I interviewed, described to me how very early on the lockdown forced his team of teachers to cram a week's worth of teaching and learning into just one day, creating entirely new syllabuses which would help the students catch up on lost learning, a phrase which regretfully appeared in Boris Johnson's letter to Rishi Sunak last night in resignation. A sort of whistle-stop tour of what should have taken much longer to teach. And this is what the sixth form head said. So the teachers spend a huge amount of time planning for that day, and then once they've done it and delivered it, they're exhausted. And it's back to planning another whole day of, for example, English Literature A-level. That system isn't well set up for any student, but certainly the ones with disabilities, it's going to be really tough on them because if they need movement breaks or if they need if they have a shorter attention span. All of this is documented in their EHCP, the Education Healthcare Plan. But then mainstream schools won't always take account of all their needs. It's a one-size-fits-all approach that tries to cram everything into a GCSE class or a BTEC class under the guise of hybrid learning, or trying to limit the rate of COVID infection by limiting the number of people on site at school. The fatigue and the exhaustion that the sixth form head notes here in his staff as well as in his students is crucial to keep in mind. And another interviewee, a SEN teacher, notes that what it was like for her doing this extra work. And she writes, or says rather, that in the initial lockdown, I remember preparing work in such a way that it was self-explanatory to kids with SEN, which was really hard because these were SEN students in foundation learning tier, which is pre-GCSE. They had high learning needs and struggled with basic things like writing and telling the time. Excerpt B. The role of disciplinarian is demanded of educators more than ever at precisely the time when disciplinary structures are breaking down. An HLTA that I interviewed noted here how her role in the classroom totally changed during the lockdown when the classroom went online, into that of the disciplinarian, which required her to hold students to account in a digital environment where no one was sure what chasing them up really meant. She said, "You wouldn't hear from students for weeks, literally weeks. You would try calling their parents wouldn't pick up the phone. I checked my emails for a couple of weeks after the summer holiday started because I knew that some students didn't get round to completing their work or they had internet issues. So I would check just to see if there were any urgent emails from students that had come through." So in this concise example, the pressures that educational support was, that exemplify the pressures that educational support was under, it took staff such as this HLTA going beyond her 9 to 5 or even 5 to 9 working week to check in on students, enacting the in loco parentis, which Fisher described as teachers becoming surrogate parents. I pressed this at the HLTA on the point about checking her work emails out of hours and during her summer holidays, and she said the following, that it made sense just to check, just in case, because the SEN students, these were SEN students, and they weren't necessarily taught email etiquette, so you would need to make sure, just to be safe. It wouldn't be your fault, but at least you could eliminate the feeling of being responsible. This responsibility to uphold email etiquette is an amplified version of what Paul Mason, the I think now ex-Channel 4 journalist, announced back in 2015 as the new normal for a post-capitalist working environment which blurs the boundaries between work and leisure and compels the employee to just check their emails, which he writes leads to people adapted to this network lifestyle to adopt multiple personalities, both in reality and online. And Mason contrasts this new networked, arguably rhizomatic individual with the worker of the Keynesian era who had a single character. At work, in the local bar, in the social club, at the football terraces, they were essentially the same person. And as an interesting contrast to the testimonials so far put forward, which have more or less cast the pandemic as the principal villain, another interviewee, a SEN teacher, saw the pandemic actually as something of a scapegoat. And she said that, "I felt there was a little bit of blame everything on the pandemic. There were these 3 or 4 students in my A-level business class who would be there every lesson. They'd have their cameras on, they'd be asking questions, they'd be doing work. Then there'd be 4 or 5 students that just wouldn't engage at all. Their mental health was rapidly declining. And then there was the middle lot, who were kind of okay, but a bit flaky." Interestingly, the SEN teacher points to a trend in her remote learning business class, which reflects the way that every classroom has presumably always been prior to the pandemic. And that is, there is the distribution of students who are working hard, those who are not working hard, and then those in the middle. This implies that actually the lockdown changed very little from the normal classroom ratios. And to push this point a bit further, take a look at this graph here. It's a bit blurry. It's a clip from a YouTube video. But it shows grade distributions from the results of a midterm summer exam. And you see here that it has a small minority of high achieving grades, and then a larger minority of low achieving grades, and then the largest, the majority, which is the middle, of students that maybe the SEN teacher would call okay but a bit flaky. Excerpt C. Families buckling under the pressures of capitalism, which requires both parents to work. Here we can surmise that the pressures of capitalism in the time of COVID required that staff, like parents, worked overtime, and moreover that lower paid staff went above and beyond their role in order to help the students. For the HLTA, always the emphasis seemed to be deeply self-critical, i.e. not feeling like her job was being done effectively, not feeling like colleagues' jobs could be done well, and the result, as she alluded to, is feelings of inadequacy. She said, personally, before the pandemic, I was making a real effort to be a more positive person, and then from lockdown it was harder. It didn't feel like the HLTAs could do our jobs properly, and then you would feel inadequate, like, am I doing enough? Can I be doing more? And you couldn't do more because you were being told just to send emails and make phone calls. On the other hand, this same HLTA also identified the benefits of the working from home directive, regarding it as an opportunity to circumvent the problems and barriers presented by other workplace processes. She said that having the work from home option isn't a bad option. If you've got a student in a wheelchair who maybe their transport doesn't come and collect them, then they can still log in at home and still study, and they don't miss out on a day's worth of learning. Here, the working from home option is regarded as a viable alternative, particularly when our other essential systems infrastructures, such as accessible transport, fail. For the sixth form head, he spoke of the pressures of the lockdown manifesting in symptoms of different impairments, disabilities and illnesses suffered by his students. Crucially, these are impairments, disabilities and illnesses which hadn't yet been identified by the medical professionals. It's a long one. We've got students who've developed tics that have never had a tic in their life. Psychologists are putting that down to the stresses of COVID. They've lived through the time of COVID from the ages of 14 and a half all the way up to 16 and 17, and some have now got diagnoses of serious conditions of tics and seizures. The psychiatrists, trying to find possible causes, have come up with this as related to stress and anxiety. For students to have witnessed the whole world shift more than it shifted in the last 100 years, with policy change, medical change, the news, the media, whatever they've taken in over those years of COVID, has now really impacted them with medical conditions they never had before. The medical professionals are working on trying to find a medical cause for the seizures, but they're unable to find a medical cause of it. They're just ruling stuff out. A neurologist is always going to want to clinically diagnose someone, but they're unable to find a cause medically. The sixth form head might have been consciously referring to the previous century when modernity brought with it the last great pandemic, and I'm happy to go into this in more detail in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But if we look briefly at the experiences of one of modernism's greatest authors, Virginia Woolf, we see medicine in the early 1900s classifying a sick woman as healthy, a woman, quote, being told repeatedly by doctors that there is nothing physically wrong. A woman remaining medically undiagnosed, based mostly on medical professionals ruling stuff out, to quote the sixth form head. In their incredible book, Ill Feelings, published by Fitzcarraldo, I'd really recommend this, Alice Hattrick recalls the way that their mother's illnesses were viewed with suspicion by doctors. Hattrick writes that in the results of their mother's MRI scan, quote, the neurologist felt the need to state that she was very emotional and that she cried during the appointment. And then, speaking of Woolf, Woolf knew without knowing what was really wrong with her that you can have a problem, you can name a problem, influenza, tired heart, any number of ways, and still not know how to solve it. Very emotional was the profoundly non-medical term that the neurologist chose to reach for here. It is, however, also a synonym for the overtly medical term neurasthenia, with which Virginia Woolf was diagnosed in about 1912. As Leonard Woolf wrote of his wife's diagnosis in his diaries, I don't think that any of the doctors knew of the cause of the disease, which they called neurasthenia. It was a name, a label. The following from Susan Wendell in her wonderful book, The Rejected Body, which summarizes a way around this problem of naming an unknown ailment, calls for what might be called medical modesty. She writes that many people with medical authority seem to lack the courage, self-confidence, or modesty to simply say, we know you are in pain, you're dizzy or nauseated, but we don't know why. In her memoir, Giving Up the Ghosts, Hilary Mantel describes the cancelling of her own fertility and the misdiagnoses she received. And she calls medical non-knowing idiopathic. That is, diseases about which doctors have no bloody idea. Perhaps the sixth form head's testimonial demonstrates that COVID presents the medical profession with similar category problems. Last excerpt. Excerpt D, instilling the most basic behavioural protocols in students and providing pastoral and emotional support for students who are in some cases only minimally socialised. Again, this is a fairly long one. From the sixth form head. Students were ill-equipped to do any real studying given such a long time they had been sat in their bedrooms. Students came to my college with very low morale, very low self-esteem. They'd been unable to visit any college or sixth form setting. But you're asking a young person with disabilities to choose the next step in their education blind. They couldn't visit a college. A lot of colleges for about 18 months wouldn't allow any visitors in. So for our students to not set foot in a place or meet a real person face to face to talk about their needs, their courses, their ambitions, their desires, that really damaged some of those external students. They just felt uncared for and isolated further from society. For students with SEN, not only had they had their year 11 just out of nowhere ended, whether they had any ambitions of going to the school prom, or having their shirt signed by their friends, or sitting their exams, or having a sports day, having a leavers party with the parents, to have lost out on any of those events within life, this created a more nervous, timid young person that's then got to meet a new head of sixth form that's got a mask on, that's walking them around an empty building. So I'll conclude in a moment, but as I do, I just want to keep that image in mind, what it would be like to enter a new school or indeed a workplace for the first time as a nervous, timid young person, to meet an employer in a mask, in an empty building, and being asked to decide your own future. There's no proper way to wrap up this session because, as I mentioned earlier, the whole pandemic and its legacy is still ongoing, and to wrap up would be to deny just how current it all still is. But I will say that three days ago, the journalist, Guardian journalist John Harris wrote an article which helpfully brings me back to Fisher's remarks about the stresses of neoliberal approaches to education and to perhaps the competitiveness that David alluded to earlier, specifically with SEND in mind. Writing about government proposals to revise the processes of EHCPs, Harris wrote that the new system proposed in the government document would not be based on the needs of the student, but on the budgets available at that particular institution. And he says, whereas the current system enshrines the fundamental principle that a child or young person's needs have to dictate the provision they receive, the Green Paper suggests a new national framework of banding and price tariffs for funding, which look like the first stirrings of the system explicitly being built around the tightening of budgets. As ever, the usual Tory doublethink is glaring. For all its talk of empowerment, to sustain a teetering system that is crying out for an adequate level of funding and fresh approaches, the government solution is to grab enough power to smother basic entitlements in stifling bureaucracy and pushing families aside. And I'll conclude there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Saul. As Saul said there will be a Q&A, but right at the end after all three speakers. So I'm sure you will have questions, but just hold them for the end, please, when everyone's spoken. Okay, so next we have Michelle Worthington. So Michelle is Principal Research Fellow at the Sydney Dehaan Research Centre, Canterbury Christchurch University. She recently completed a PhD at Liverpool Hope University, supported by a studentship award from Newman University and co-supervised by Professor Bolt. Her thesis is titled, What are the lived experiences of theatre practice and disability among professional directors and actors in theatres funded by Arts Council England? An interpretive phenomenological analysis. Michelle's paper today is entitled, How Might the Pandemic Promote Increased Engagement with Disability in Theatre? Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Great. So, I titled this presentation, How Might the Pandemic Promote Increased Engagement with Disability in Theatre? So before I begin, just to say that it's really lovely to share some of my thoughts with you today. And CCDS has been a place that I felt when I was doing my PhD as a place of knowledge, but also enormous welcome, which I really have appreciated. And it still is that, so thank you very much. So I want to explore with you 3 things today. Yes, what it means to promote increased engagement with disability in theatre and how has the pandemic impacted this? Why is it necessary? What was the theatre climate for disabled people pre-pandemic? And where unresolved issues were impacting trust in the industry? And finally, as the theatre climate continues to shift and we re-emerge from the pandemic, I want to ask what is really needed to ensure increased engagement with disability in the sector's recovery. So, in March the 16th, 2020, the live entertainment industry closed a week before the first national lockdown. And with that arose the recognition that the pandemic would impact livelihoods, health, social care and creativity in a magnified way for disabled people. Concerns specific to theatre included how moving to online arts delivery might widen a digital divide common to disabled people, and how policy around vaccine passports and social distancing might exclude disabled audiences as venues reopened. It was clear that the never-seen-before progress that had been made in recent years to increase the representation of disabled people in theatre was at risk of stepping back. So recognising this threat, the UK Disability Arts Alliance emerged in April that same year with its UK-wide We Shall Not Be Removed campaign. Over 1,000 people joined the campaign in the first few weeks, representing every role across the creative industries. We Shall Not Be Removed promoted the voices of disabled cultural practitioners and disability-inclusive organisations through the pandemic and advocated for a more inclusive recovery. The Alliance's efforts to promote increased engagement with disability during the pandemic included an open letter to UK cultural ministers, social media campaigns, the representation of disabled people on key industry and parliamentary platforms, a survey report, and the publication of 7 principles for inclusive recovery in September 2020, which we'll return to later. Arts Council England provided emergency funding to support this and other related projects. And you can take a look at that. Their website is weshallnotberemoved.com. So I want to show you this cartoon created by Dave Lupton for the campaign. Not only does it capture the pandemic's impact on the arts, but also a longer-term struggle for disabled people engaged in the arts sector. The image on the screen shows a yellow road leading towards a town labelled Welcome to Main Street Arts. On the road is a group of people, including a wheelchair user, pushing a huge red ball with disability art written on it. There are also names of established disabled-led theatre companies listed on the ball. In a speech bubble it says, "Come on folks, we just need one last push." At the opposite end of the road to the town is the word COVID written among flames, with the idea that it's burning up the road behind the group. So firstly, this image highlights one of the many complexities confronted by disabled people in the theatre industry, a divide between what might be considered disability and mainstream art sectors. There's an ongoing redefining of where individuals believe these categories should be separated or interlink. There is still a sense within the disabled community that actors who self-define as disabled people and choose to work professionally in mainstream theatre are somehow compromising the political impact of their work if the subject of their performance is not about disability itself. Lupton's artwork also captures a struggle for disabled-led theatre and arts organisations and individual disabled people to fully engage in the mainstream sector. And thirdly, it implies that COVID has added pressure to a struggle for progress, depleting efforts towards a coming together of disability and mainstream arts practice. Remarking on what was discovered through the We Shall Not Be Removed campaign, its co-founder Andrew Miller said, "It revealed the full fragility of disabled people's place in the cultural sector following the pandemic. The impacts on disabled freelancers and disability arts organisations are significant and require additional targeted support from funders and a rebuilding of trust from within the wider sector." I want to consider these factors of fragility and trust in the sector as issues extending beyond the pandemic, as I share some findings from my PhD research. This explored lived experience of theatre and disability and offers nuanced insight into what is happening on the ground in the theatre industry from the perspective of actors and directors. Drawing on the history and critical knowledge of disability studies, my research involved interpretive phenomenological analysis of interviews with 7 actors who self-define as disabled people with physical impairments and 12 directors who identified as non-disabled. All participants had been in professional employment in Arts Council England's most highly funded theatres since 2015. So what was the wider theatre climate like for disabled people working on the ground in theatre before the pandemic? The year 2015 marked a unique moment in theatre history. Arts Council England announced a fundamental shift in its diversity strategy, deciding for the first time to publish annual workforce data of its national portfolio organisations, which included disability. For the first time, major theatres were held accountable for the position disabled people held in their workforce. Theatre critic Lynn Gardner described how no artistic director planning a programme or casting a show can hide any longer behind a lack of knowledge. People will be on your case. The Arts Council's baseline figures revealed the disabled workforce stood at only 4% against a working age population of 19%. Latest figures rose to only 7%, making clear that there were and are ongoing complex issues around disabled people and a need to increase engagement with disability in theatre that extends beyond the impacts of the pandemic. Trust in a shifting theatre climate emerged as a sub-theme from actors' lived experiences of theatre practice and disability in my study. This exposed how actors interpret their career position and future ambition alongside whether they feel changes witnessed in theatre can be trusted as long-term progress. The pre-pandemic theatre climate posed considerable day-to-day challenges for individual actors in my study. Approaches to practice, particularly in work with directors lacking disability knowledge or experience, seemed far from idyllic and added significant pressure to the routine demands of their jobs. Pete's observation was that directors know all the notes, but sometimes haven't quite learnt the tune. That resonated across the group, highlighting how directors' inherited distance from disability impacted experiences in rehearsals. There were ongoing issues with the collection of diversity data, suspicion of box ticking, and a common preference among actor participants to disassociate the term disabled from their professional identity. Actors described difficulty and skill in navigating inappropriate access, language, representation, and the discomfort of non-disabled directors they worked with. They also exposed personal disquiet about professional recognition, authenticity in casting, and roles performed on stage. All these issues experienced in day-to-day theatre seemed ongoing concerns for actors in my study, limiting their ability to envisage the future. Nevertheless, broader views of overall practice in the industry were largely positive. There was shared opinion among actor participants that approaches to working with disabled people in theatre are shifting. Referring to the National Theatre, Moira noted, "It's growing, the amount of disabled people that have been put on stage. There's a shift happening." Sophie commented, "I do think people are judged more on their merits and their ability, more than they were a few years ago. Disabled actors are being represented in a way they never have. Actors perceive substantial change in conversation, casting, and the visibility of disabled people on stage, seeing this as recent, unprecedented progress, and the Arts Council's shift in strategy as accelerating this. Progress was observed at a distance and experienced firsthand." James, for example, let's have a look to see if there's quotes there, noted how sizable roles are opening up to him. He explained, "I've played a couple of parts that have felt much more in the forefront. I think it's happening more and more that people are trusting." He perceived change in directors' level of comfort working with him, which lessened his own discomfort in rehearsals, saying, "That seems to be happening more and more, so I feel very comfortable in the room a lot of the time." James experienced positive change in casting and rehearsals. However, after describing this, he made the following remark. "But as I said earlier as well, you never know what's going on behind the scenes as well. Who knows, maybe it's getting worse and I'm just not seeing it." He laughs. Throwaway comments from actors added detail to a personal difficulty trusting that change witnessed in the industry was authentic and long-term. Pete and Lydia conveyed similar struggles trusting changes in casting. Both described insufficiencies in casting approaches where an actor is considered for any role, and they added to their struggle. Broadly, Pete described the outlook for disabled people in theatre as promising, really. I mean, I think it's the most open the profession has been. Compared to when I started, there was nothing. You wouldn't get near a main stage. He expanded on how this impacts him personally, saying, "It's given me an opportunity to play a greater variety of roles. All I've done is the same role over and over again, a cripple, a saint. I'm going to be seen for the main stage, all that sort of stuff. A lot of stuff coming in now. So it makes my life easier in terms of I can get work. And also when I get work, there's an understanding that, that I need a level of support to sort things out, like accommodation and assistance and things like that. What was denied in terms of career choice, roles, performance spaces and logistical access seemed to be now viewed as open. However, like James, Pete's aside was, it may all be a fad. It may all be, a great new thing that won't last very long, but I feel like some of the routes are in. Despite describing a variety of roles opening to him at the end of his interview, Pete stated, "No, I don't think we'll ever. I don't get too many lead roles," highlighting how progress still feels fragile. For Lydia, it was not only whether roles suited her or not that dictated her ambition, but a pragmatism about where she saw the industry. Asked if she was only looking to play characters written as disabled, Lydia explains, "I could play anyone and everyone. Yeah, it's quite frustrating, really. Yeah, pretty much. And I think it's less about what I think and more about the reality of it. But it's upsetting. Still, that's how it is." Whatever these actors' true ambitions are, it seems further progress is needed in casting before they feel able to trust that playing a range of roles is a possibility and can broaden their ambitions accordingly. The term lucky was prevalent across actor participants' interviews, yet its use implied more than a simple break in talent recognition. Lydia attributes success, getting an agent into drama school and her first theatre job, to being lucky, really lucky, luckier than I think. She later explains, "I've personally been quite lucky in playing some quite chunky roles, but that might be the luck of the draw. I've had some really nice directors." Speaking about directors' comfort in working with him, James notes, "Professionally, it might be I've been quite lucky, extraordinarily lucky in certain situations." And regarding directors taking her views on accessibility on board, Moria comments, "I've been pretty lucky in that I've worked with, some good people." Sophie notes, "I've been really lucky," speaking about conversations with directors about role types she can play. Identifying luck as a variable in the fragility of acting work is not in itself unusual. However, for actors here, luck referred to the attitude of non-disabled people they encounter. Based on their comments, a lucky break is about finding directors who are affable, open to learning, to explore new territory, and comfortable engaging with disability matters. Factors in considering their future in theatre that not every actor has to contend with. As my study only represents actors who have been employed in major theatres, the lack of ownership of their professional achievements in the industry seemed alarming. For Neil, there was a deep concern that without the individuals he trusts as allies, progress might reverse. He noted, "A lot of advances that we've made have been very individual rather than organisational. When they leave, it might go back." Finally, from Moira, there was a sense of struggling to trust her acceptance in the sector. She appeared to be reconciling past discrimination with recent positive experiences and described, "I've always had a really difficult relationship with mainstream stuff. And I was really gunning for mainstream stuff and I wasn't getting anywhere. So I really kind of gave up on that. I was going for interviews that really felt soul-destroying, and sometimes doing jobs that felt really soul-destroying." As a result of disappointment in mainstream theatre, Moira steered her ambition away from the type of text-based acting in major theatres that my study was primarily concerned with. However, this is where she now finds opportunity and appears to be re-evaluating her relationship with the sector. As a result, she continued, "I think the landscape has changed a bit, and now there are mainstream directors who ask for disabled talent." The notion of rebuilding disabled people's trust in the arts sector is certainly complex, with the pandemic most likely adding another dimension to these actors' questions about how much of a shift in theatre has really taken place. The few actors' comments that I've shared here don't offer a definitive answer to this, but highlight a dual narrative. There's an explicit story of positive progress in the industry, optimism around the scope and scale of onstage representation, dialogue, ease of working across disabled and non-disabled communities, and an understanding of access issues. There's also an implicit story, disquiet with hidden agenda in casting, a lack of ownership of professional achievements, and reliance on decision makers and funding bodies. a perceived fragile future which limits professional ambition. It is possible actors in my study chose to celebrate positive change and efforts towards progress. However, the explicit story perhaps also feels the right thing to say, more comfortable to tell or to hear than the implicit. In her work on race and inclusion, Sarah Ahmed notes how the expectation of research involves a desire to hear happy stories of disability, of diversity. Instead, phenomenology brings what is behind what does not get seen to the surface. It is by showing how we are stuck, by attending to what is habitual and routine, that we can keep open the possibility of habit changes. We can assume progress made in increasing the onstage representation of disabled people has been carried forward as live theatre has returned. It is already evident that talented disabled people are again represented on our stages and screens. The RSC has just opened its production of Richard III with Arthur Hughes, who describes himself as a disabled actor who is limb different, cast in the title role. He describes this as a big gesture from the RSC, taking disability representation seriously. Just here, there's images of these 3 actors that I'm mentioning on the screen. The BBC drama, Then Barbara Met Alan, you may have seen it, was released in March this year. It's a drama based on real events in disability history, written by Jack Thorne, who has personal disability experience, and Genevieve Barr, who's deaf, with a cast of disabled people, all established theatre and screen actors. Another example is Amy Trigg, a wheelchair user who played her first season at the RSC when theatres closed, and her first full-length play, Reasons You Shouldn't Love Me, was one of the first live theatre shows to open in London's West End and is now touring nationally. Great. So, as I draw this to a close, the We Will Not Be Removed campaign's 7 principles for an inclusive recovery provide an ongoing roadmap for equality in the arts, possibly influencing the positive progress that has remained. The principles highlight legal obligations and a need for combating ableism, consulting disabled people, clear COVID measures for disabled audiences, and celebrating disabled people's talent and workforce diversity. Again, you can read these online on weshallnotberemoved.com. All important factors in considering what an inclusive recovery might look like. But where does this leave actors like those in my study, who most likely have returned to work to negotiate complex interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships and issues of disability, to return to work with those that are still learning the notes and the tune? There is perhaps one positive aspect of the pandemic that is relevant here, and that is the pause in the business of theatre caused by the pandemic, which offered the opportunity for reflection. This may have been beneficial in reimagining tired, cliched, or at worst, ignorant and offensive theatrical traditions and practices that have been routinely critiqued by disability scholars, disabled artists and activists, but perhaps not by individual theatre professionals outside that sphere. Theatre critic Lynn Gardner acknowledged this space as beneficial, recognising in the busyness of theatre, we are always going to be more inclusive tomorrow. So as I close, I wonder what an 8th principle for an inclusive recovery that acknowledges increased engagement with disability in theatre as a shared, ongoing and personal endeavour might be. Perhaps it would be to ensure continued space for individuals employed in theatre to consider not only how practice or structures ensure inclusivity, but their own position in a process of engagement with disability. This is a live dynamic for disabled and non-disabled people in the industry, shifted by changing policy and practices. It is a process that involves learning from disability, exploring new territory, leads to familiarity across disabled and non-disabled communities, and results in shared responsibility for change. Inside this sometimes uncomfortable industry climate is a struggle that continues beyond the pandemic to find a way forward. In theatre, lived experiences of disability matter if we want to understand where individuals are stuck in their engagement with disability, and if we want to see long-term change as less fragile and trusted reality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. And so to introduce our final speaker, Arianna Introna. So Arianna Introna completed her PhD in Scottish Literature at the University of Stirling in 2018 Her project explored narratives of disability in Scottish writing and how these relate to the politics of belonging at work. The politics of belonging at work in Scottish cultural and literary studies. Culture and politics from a perspective that brought into conversation disability studies and Marxist autonomist theory. Her current research considers a broad period of time from the start of the 20th century to the present day in order to get a sense of the changing articulation between narratives of disability and class and of its relationship with contemporaneous nation discourses and context. And as we noted earlier, she recently published her book, Autonomous Narratives of Disability in Modern Scottish Writing, Crip Enchantments. And her paper today is called Crip Utopias for Post-Pandemic Times, a Lived Experience Perspective. So welcome, Arianna.
Yeah, okay, thanks so much. And Michelle for two amazing presentations before me, and thanks to the CCDS for welcoming me again. It's amazing for me to be here, and I feel very grateful for this, and also for every time I came here from the start of my PhD in very difficult moments and times where I felt overwhelmed by the avoidance of disability in my own discipline. Every time I came here, I felt so welcome and inspired. So it's great to see you flourishing in so many different ways. So thanks so much. So about my paper. So I'll get started. So in proportion as the COVID-19 pandemic dispersed body-minded vulnerability and contingency across society, if unequally, the critical lens afforded by the lived experience of disabled people during and before the pandemic became overtly indispensable for understanding processes of structural violence and for imagining alternative ways of organizing relations. My presentation explores ways of contemplating our experience of disability as fundamental not only for critique, but also for remaking the world in an emancipatory direction in post or less pandemic times. So the inspiration for this paper have been, first, my participation in the lived experience leadership pilot program put together by the Disabled People Organisation Inclusion Scotland during the first lockdown, when I was introduced to the work of Baljit Sandom on lived experience, and second, my experience of participating in and contributing to the organization of activist and autonomous learning spaces online since the first lockdown, which was self-reflectively informed by my lived experience leadership journey. So my paper is very theoretical, and I will be keen to engage in more empirically grounded discussion in the Q&A session. So in my book, Crip Enchantments, I use the concept of Crip Enchantments to describe literary imaginaries which denaturalize the organization of society along lines dictated by normalcy and capitalism, so capitalist normalcy, while visibilizing alternatives to it. So this paper explores the ways in which the Crip enchantment of the world that the pandemic has allowed cannot be separated from the challenge to hold onto it as the basis for Crip world remaking practices in post or less pandemic times. So as Baljit Sandhu argues in relation to the lived experience that comes out of to the lived expertise that comes out of lived experience, our aim should be to recognize the intrinsic as well as the instrumental value lived experience brings to the table, and then rebuild our systems and structures around that expertise. So my paper will therefore, first of all, trace the critical significance of sick and lived experience during the pandemic. Second, it will discuss how such lived experience animated sick and Crip utopias that unfolded in the Blockian sense of being concrete, already existing forms of life. Third, it will argue that these sick and Crip utopias can be read as these modernist revolutions materialized by the spreading out across society of lived experience of body-minded vulnerability and contingency. So lived experience of illness and disability during the COVID pandemic has been entangled with widespread lived experience of body-mind vulnerability that overspills the able, disabled, and then healthy, ill divide. And this calls for analysis of the critical power that derives from the encounter between theory and lived experience as a starting point for theorizing the contribution that SIC and Crip lived experience can bring to the reconfiguration of understandings and realities in post or less pandemic times. So Lois McNay, in her recent engagement with the nexus between theory and lived experience, traces out the possibilities for critique of oppression this encounter opens up, and the intersectional, situated, and anti-essentialist framework within which this critique unfolds. So for McNay, theorizing from experience is an approach which affirms the pivotal importance of the lived reality of those directly affected to an unmasking critique of oppression. So manifold directions of inquiry have emerged to tease out the relevance of disability politics to the injustices and potential for emancipatory change that have marked pandemic times. The epistemic possibilities afforded by Crip lived experience have first of all allowed an appreciation of how the pandemic offers a privileged lens through which to denounce the differential disposability of life. As Alice Wong put it, As Alice Wong put it, in this critical time when scarcity is a reality, you see the hierarchy. Certain groups are valued over others. This is the world that so many disabled and chronically ill people already live in. Our lives are still seen as expendable. Now the magnitude is much greater. Secondly, the fact that the pandemic upends the illusory power of ableism has been declared as significant, has been seen as significant for society at large, not just for disabled people. As Niklas Altermark argued, our societies are confronted with the fact that bodies are fragile and open to injury. As a result, ableist ideals of self-sufficiency and self-mastery suddenly appear as illusory. Third, also a critique of the individualistic framing characteristic of the discourse of pandemic governance was performed as an entry point from the start of the pandemic into the delineation of forms of Crip word-making grounded in opposite logics and relationalities. As Alice Shippers noted, the current public health measures are rooted in a merely individualistic approach, as reflected by its main feature, social distancing, and developing a counter-story. For this reason, developing a counter-story of solidarity is what will keep the disability community alive in this time of crisis. Also, the call for accessible structures to be embedded within all forms of practice was voiced as key for identifying the basis of alternative forms of social organization, and commenting on how the pandemic had witnessed the development of a degree of commitment to accessibility that disabled people had been advocating for already, and the risk for this commitment to lapse as soon as a post-pandemic would be entered or declared as now. Wong reflected, "My hope for coming out of this pandemic is that we don't return to the status quo. Many don't realize that normal was actually not great for a lot of people. Just because all of the non-disabled people go back to work, that does not mean we should stop thinking about accessibility." So if, as Dan Goodley, Rebecca Lawson, Kirsty Lydiard, and Catherine Ransby Cole suggest, living through a geopolitical moment where many people are dealing with matters of life and death inevitably raises existential questions. What is it that we want? How might disability disrupt normative desires? How might we desire disability? Wong's and Shippers' reflections, just quoted, indicate the extent to which the alternative order of accessibility and solidarity that perspectives rooted in Crip lived experience have called for during the pandemic is what may make Crip words desired and desirable in post-pandemic times. This may be especially the case because lived experience of illness and disability in pandemic times has already contributed to remaking the word in more inclusive directions. As Baljit Sanju argues, our aim should be to recognize the intrinsic as well as instrumental value lived expertise, as suggested, brings to the table, and then rebuild our systems and structures around that expertise. So at the start of the pandemic, as Arianna and Chandler and Erickson speculated that COVID time might allow a particular kind of Crip word making, that engages Crip practices that may have seemed impossible 5 weeks ago. This becoming possible of the seemingly impossible has indeed panned out, as online spaces have developed structured around multiple access needs in ways that resonate with the Blockian conception of concrete utopias, or collective movements towards the opening and organizing of new horizons in the here and now. And this materialization of new horizons in the present can be read as a sign that the opening created by the dispersal of body-minded contingency and vulnerability across society has generated a form of lived experience that has forced a reorganization of collective spaces around multiple access needs. From a lived experience perspective, this is a fundamental way in which the moment of crisis and collective emancipation that the pandemic has opened up may have been grasped, as the alternative realities, rhythms, perceptions, and life words that our sick and Crip life words are entangled with have become the pivot on which alternative collective realities have emerged. Along lines that may lend support to this assessment, Monica Greco maintained that seizing the crisis that the pandemic constitutes originates from an oppositional and embodied assertion of the epistemic validity of the knowledge produced by lived experience of illness. She reflected, so here we find ourselves at ground zero, observing the experience of illness and the pandemic as if our lives depended on it. The lay perspective and stories of sickness acquire new meaning, new status, a new kind of relevance. The crisis must be seized and not wasted. So Greco's anticipation of radical change as brought on by the owning of and acting upon our lived experience of illness, disability, and as something that already exists, evokes utopian thinking as suggested of the Blockian kind, where utopian indicates not something abstract, but something emerging from Bloch says the contents of most immediate nearness that still ferment entirely in the darkness of the lived moment. So if for Bloch we need the most powerful telescope, that of polished utopian consciousness, in order to penetrate precisely the nearest nearness, namely the most immediate immediacy in which the core of self-location and being here still lies, in which at the same time the whole knot of the word secret is to be found, Greco's reflections suggest that it is lived experience of illness and disability that function as a telescope through which to grasp the nearest nearness and most immediate immediacy, from which utopian thinking springs. And if for Bloch, utopian thinking is directed towards changing the world and informing the desire to change it, the assertion of a lived experience perspective appears to possess a collective orientation that combines the generation of new understanding with the visibilization of alternate collective realities as already existing in the here and now. So the flourishing of new understandings alongside the visibilization of alternate collective realities already existing now during the pandemic was, in the now of the pandemic, was from the start inseparable from the question of access. Tanya Tichkowski argues that access is tied to the social organization of participation, even to belonging. Access not only needs to be sought out and fought for, legally secured, physically measured, and politically protected. It also needs to be understood as a complex form of perception that organizes socio-political relations between people in social space. Since online meetings became the main form of participation and community building during lockdown, access has been the main form of perception underpinning their design and operation, based on my own experience. Too many insights are yielded up by the encounter between my experience of fatigue and sensory disruption and my experience of co-organizing, facilitating, and attending as a participant online activist meeting and autonomous learning initiatives. First, the commitment to seeing each other's needs has come to inform activities before, during, and after meetings, through a self-reflective, continuous assessment of what works and what does not for each of us. Secondly, these ways of embedding access within online relationalities has come to be a matter of fact, the new normal rather than the exception. The organization of online meetings to meet participants' diverse and changing needs since lockdown has entrenched access as a form of perception and as a fundamental lens through which to see each other's needs and dignity and make sure that these are centered in the organization of our autonomous spaces. So the creation of collective spaces in which our Crip and sick realities fit at the height of the pandemic foregrounded the extent to which, whether we identify as ill or healthy disabled or unhealthy disabled, collectivized life words of body-minded contingency provide a starting point for remaking society in its entirety in the direction of universal accessibility. If any crisis, to quote Martin Parker, asks questions of common sense, it exposes the problems with existing arrangements, provokes responses that were previously unthinkable, and collectively reminds us that all that happens to be solid can very easily melt into air. The pandemic has been a crisis that offers potential for the remaking of words on the basis of the knowledges and Crip utopias spawned by lived experience of collectivized vulnerability and contingency. Leonard Davies' famous description of the world we inhabit as one in which we are all non-standard, and it is under that standard that we should be able to find that this modernist ethic provides an important starting point for elevating access as a form of perception derived from Crip experience to access as a form of perception that generates understandings, practices, words, structures, and infrastructures that seek to accommodate everyone's access needs, whether these are connected to disability or to class, gender, and other social relations. For this reason, I suggest the world-changing power of post-pandemic Crip utopias and lived experience manifests and operates in the form of these modernist revolutions, namely as a reorganization of everyday practice and relations that transform society by undoing the boundaries that separate the sick and the Crip from the healthy and the abled. So Davies' concept of this modernism grasps both the vulnerabilization to which people are differentially exposed and the possibility for remaking the world along lines of support and solidarity by starting from an understanding of the world as a space in which impairment, as Davies says, is the rule and normalcy is the fantasy. Dependence is the reality and independence grandiose thinking. While differential vulnerabilization defines both pandemic and post-pandemic times, Crip utopias during the pandemic proliferated prototypes of experience that, in Davies' words, disassemble the regnant fantasies of wholeness and completion, and in this way materialize at this modernist reorganization of society. So with this in mind, the Crip utopias that crystallize forms of sick and Crip lived experience during the pandemic can be taken to index the unfolding of this modernist revolution in Ivan von Redeker's sense of the term. So von Redeker understands revolution as disentangled from the inevitable associations with the storming of the Bastille, and as associated with a form of radical change that is initiated in the interstitial spaces of a social order, and that leads through lengthy processes of transfer to a new constellation. So this sense of revolution captures the ways in which the Crip utopias and lived experience that have defined pandemic times operate by rehearsing, in von Redeker's words, by rehearsing the future and repurposing the present to generate new constellations in which the unthinkable comes to be taken for granted. So this modernist form of interstitial change is defined, created by the pandemic, is defined by a path-breaking persistence, which also for persistence in post-pandemic time on condition of creating the infrastructure necessary to sustain Crip utopias beyond the delimitation of pandemic times, defined by governments. So this paper has sought, so I'll conclude, this paper has sought to develop an understanding of sick and Crip lived experience of the pandemic as unfolding both Crip utopias and these modernist revolutions. It has been a reflection on the ways in which in pandemic and post-pandemic times our lived experience of Crip and sick body-minds affords a revolutionary potential not just for rethinking understandings of health and illness, normalcy and body-minded non-normativity, but also for remaking the inaccessible worlds that we live in. Its critical intent has been to foreground the ways in which our configuration of realities and understandings of illness, disability, body-minded contingency occasioned by the pandemic cannot be decoupled from the potential to create accessible collective realities and spaces, precisely because in post-pandemic times, the word remaking power of body-minded contingency and vulnerability has infused social imaginaries for now. So the sick and Crip lived experience that underpinned sick and Crip utopias and these modernist revolutions at the height of the pandemic calls for a refusal to let these utopias recede as a post-pandemic pursuit of normalcy reasserts itself. So, if Crip lived experience of the pandemic has generated Crip enchantments that have made possible Crip and sick utopias, and if the expertise that derives from that experience has an intrinsic as well as instrumental value to inform the rebuilding of words around it, what is to be done in the coming pandemic, less pandemic or post-pandemic times? In what many want to declare, which is what many want to declare now post-pandemic times, and many keep calling in emails to me, and I'm sure to many of us, strange times, making sure that the Crip enchantment of the word that the pandemic has allowed keeps providing the basis for Crip word remaking practices is a challenge that we as disabled people, theorists, activists, have a unique responsibility to stand up to. One of the legacies of the pandemic might be the appreciation that staying with the uncomfortableness that Crip and sick lived experience brings is entangled with sharing it with others and with collectivizing the myriad alternative realities it originates. If, as Sando argues, the owning of lived experience may place us in a position to change the world for the better, the importance of sick and Crip lived experience for post-pandemic times lies in the epistemic revolutions it animates, as we turn outward, armed with new understandings of our word remaking power, to create Crip words with others. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks very much.